There are names that fade because time forgets them, and then there are names that are erased, not by war or disaster, but by silence. Once, Tartaria stretched boldly across the maps of the world, a vast and mysterious land painted on parchment in sweeping letters that crossed from the heart of Europe to the edge of Asia. It was not a rumor or a myth then. It was geography, recorded by explorers, merchants, and map-makers who spoke of it as if it were as real as Rome or Cathay. Its borders were blurred by snow and distance, but its presence was undeniable. For centuries the name sat there, immense, certain, and alive. And then, without warning, it began to fade. There was no war to explain its fall, no treaty to mark its end, no empire that claimed victory over it. Instead, it simply vanished, not from the earth, but from memory. Maps that once displayed its reach began to replace it with new names: Siberia, Russia, Mongolia, pieces where once there had been something whole. Histories were rewritten, textbooks reprinted, and soon the ink that had once declared Tartaria's existence was quietly replaced by blankness. A civilization dissolved, not by fire, but by forgetting. Somewhere in the dust of forgotten libraries, old atlases still hold the ghost of that word. The letters are faint now, faded to the color of ash, as though time itself had tried to erase the proof. You can almost imagine the hands that once traced them, explorers returning from long journeys, their quills hovering over maps as they tried to capture the enormity of what they'd seen. They spoke of endless plains, of cities whose towers glinted beneath northern suns, of a people whose customs defied the known world. And yet, all that remains of them now are whispers, echoes of something too vast to truly vanish. What kind of power could erase an entire civilization so completely that even its memory feels forbidden? Perhaps it was not nature or conquest, but narrative. The slow rewriting of the human story by those who chose what should be remembered and what should be left behind. History, after all, is not written by time. It is written by hands. And sometimes those hands decide what the world is allowed to know. Tartaria's disappearance was not a collapse. It was an erasure, a quiet, meticulous redrawing of truth. To this day, no official explanation exists for its absence. Scholars call it a misinterpretation, a confusion of geography. But the old maps disagree. They still whisper their contradiction, their faint resistance to the silence that followed. It is a strange thing to stand before one of those ancient maps, to see a name that once defined half the world and realize that it no longer exists anywhere else. No monuments, no ruins, no national memory. Only the empty certainty that something once stood there, powerful enough to be seen and dangerous enough to be forgotten. Maybe that is why Tartaria lingers in the imagination, because it reminds us how fragile memory can be, how easily truth can be rewritten not through destruction, but through neglect. A civilization can survive flood and famine, invasion and collapse, but not the quiet weight of being erased. And so, across centuries of silence, Tartaria remains, not in textbooks, but in whispers, not in monuments, but in the margins of old maps. It is a name that refuses to die completely, echoing from the past like a faint signal through static. The question is no longer where Tartaria was, but why it was made to disappear. Because somewhere, beneath layers of denial and dust, the world's forgotten empire still waits to be seen. And if we wish to find it again, we must start not with discovery, but with listening to the whispers that survived the silence. Long before the word Tartaria ever reached European tongues, it was already alive in another language, the quiet ink of ancient Chinese scrolls, the rhythmic script of Persian geographers, the wandering stories of merchants who crossed oceans of grass and silence. Long before Europe drew its first uncertain borders, the East had already mapped the memory of a land vast beyond imagination. They called it by many names: the realm of the northern winds, the country of endless riders, the great steppe kingdom, but each description pointed to the same place: a world of movement, power, and mystery. In the archives of old dynasties, records speak of northern tribes who moved like shadows across the horizon. The Chinese chroniclers of the Han and Tang eras wrote of fierce horsemen who lived without walls, whose cities were built from tents that could rise and vanish with the dawn. To the south, empires built in stone and ritual struggled to understand them. These nomads seemed to belong to the wind itself, their power not in fortresses, but in freedom. They were traders, warriors, and diplomats all at once, linking distant kingdoms through routes of silk, salt, and myth. Further west, Persian scholars spoke of the same people with reverence and caution. They wrote of a world beyond the Oxus River, where winter itself seemed to have a soul, and where tribes ruled the plains like shifting constellations. The Islamic geographers of the Golden Age, men like al-Idrisi and al-Biruni, drew maps that traced the edges of this mysterious north, describing lands of iron, amber, and gold. They wrote of kings who governed by motion, of nations so large they were measured not by walls but by horizons. And in their accounts, the people of the north were not savages or invaders. They were a civilization of their own, fluid, connected, and vast. It was only later, when Europe began to listen, that the name Tartaria appeared, a word born not from discovery, but from translation. The West had no single name for what the East already knew. They called it Tartaria because they needed a boundary, a way to define what could not be contained. But in the beginning, it was never a single empire or nation. It was something grander, a living network that spanned the world's spine, carrying language, culture, and trade from one end of the continent to the other. Imagine it: caravans moving under skies so wide they seem eternal, their wheels carving stories into the earth, messengers riding from palace to palace, bearing silk and silver, rumors and songs. Across deserts, rivers, and frozen plains, this invisible web of connection pulsed with life. And through it all, there was one shared belief, that beyond the known, there existed a civilization whose reach touched the very ends of the world. Yet, as centuries passed and dynasties fell, the details began to blur. Names shifted, roots faded, and the whispers turned into legend. The traders stopped coming, the scholars stopped writing, and the world began to forget what the East had once known so well, that a civilization had ruled the northern sky, unseen and untamed. But those records still exist, hidden in libraries from Samarkand to Xi'an. Fragments of parchment still speak of the lost north, of lands ruled not by kings, but by movement, by unity, by a different kind of power. Perhaps Tartaria was never meant to be a single place, but an idea, a vast human rhythm that connected empires before they learned to call themselves separate. If Europe's maps would one day name it, the East's memories had already dreamed it. And in those dreams, the shadow of Tartaria still lingers, not as a myth, but as a truth waiting to be remembered. Because before the West began to wonder what had vanished, the East already knew what had been lost. Across the endless grasslands of Central Asia, where the sky stretches like an ocean and the horizon never ends, a sound once echoed that made the world tremble. The thunder of hooves. The earth itself seemed to move when the riders came. They were not armies in the way Europe understood armies. They were storms, swift, silent, devastating. Men born on horseback, their lives bound to the rhythm of the steppe. The Tatars, the Mongols, the horsemen of the wind. From the frozen rivers of Siberia to the deserts of Persia, their presence rewrote the meaning of distance. They carried no banners of marble gods, no grand cathedrals to mark their faith. Their temples were the open sky, their power the horizon itself. When they rode as one, tribes united under a single pulse. And that pulse, for a brief moment in time, beat louder than any empire the world had ever known. To the west, they were terror. Stories spread faster than their horses. Tales of villages consumed by fire, of arrows falling like rain, of riders who appeared from nowhere and vanished into the wind. Chroniclers called them the Tatars, and the word soon twisted into Tartars, born from Europe's own imagination. A name that sounded like Tartarus, the abyss of hell. Fear gave them myth, ignorance gave them legend. And out of that legend, a word began to take shape on maps: Tartaria. But to the east, the story was different. The Mongol unification under Temujin, whom the world would know as Genghis Khan, was not a tale of chaos, but of order. The steppe tribes that had once lived in eternal conflict became one under his banner. His rule did not begin with conquest, it began with connection. He built networks of trade, messages, and law that linked worlds once thought unreachable. From the Black Sea to the Pacific, his empire became the first true global bridge, while Europe whispered of Mons, Asia witnessed organization, a civilization not of stone walls, but of living motion. Still, the West could not comprehend what it saw. To them, the horsemen were a moving empire with no capital, no churches, no borders, something that defied the rules of civilization. The more they tried to define it, the more mysterious it became. Maps began to fill with shaded regions marked Tartaria, as if that single word could contain what the world could not explain: power without permanence, structure without city, dominion without throne. And so, the riders became symbols, not just of conquest, but of what lay beyond the edges of knowledge. They were the embodiment of movement, the idea that civilization itself could be nomadic, fluid, alive. The wind carried their language, their bloodlines, their traditions, scattering them across continents. Even after the Mongol Empire fractured and faded, the myth endured. Tartaria became not just a place, but a memory of unstoppable motion, a name that lived longer than any empire could. But every storm leaves silence behind. As centuries passed, the horsemen's trails vanished under new roads, their cities swallowed by dust, their unity replaced by the empires they had once overrun. Yet in the collective memory of humanity, something of them remained. A fascination with the unknown, with the speed of destiny, with the rhythm of hooves that once beat louder than history itself. To the west, they had been the terror of God. To the east, they were the architects of connection. But somewhere between the two, between myth and memory, fear and admiration, the name Tartaria took root. It was no longer the story of a people, but of an idea. A reminder that power can move like wind, shaping the world without leaving a monument behind. And as the last riders disappeared beyond the steppe, the question lingered like dust in the air. Who were they really? Conquerors, savages, or the builders of a forgotten unity that once held half the world together? The answer, like the wind itself, would drift toward the edges of old maps, to the place where imagination and truth first met. There was a time when the edges of the world were not borders, but mysteries. When blank parchment was a frontier of imagination, a place where monsters, miracles, and forgotten gods might still exist. Medieval Europe, confined within its kingdoms and faith, looked outward and saw the unknown not as emptiness, but as possibility. And on those fading edges of knowledge, in the pale ink of cartographers' dreams, a single word began to spread across the north: Tartaria. It was a land no one had truly seen, yet everyone seemed to believe in. Some maps painted it as a frozen kingdom stretching beyond Siberia, others as an empire of plains, rivers, and shimmering cities under northern suns. The scholars of Venice and Paris argued over its size, some claiming it rivaled all of Europe combined. To them, Tartaria was the realm where geography met faith, where curiosity met fear. Too vast to understand, too distant to confirm, it became both legend and truth at once. Mapmakers of the medieval world did not draw in precision. They drew in wonder. Each map was a prayer disguised as geography. The oceans curled like scrolls of heaven. Jerusalem sat at the center of creation, and at the world's edges, imagination took control. Dragons guarded coasts no one had reached. Angels hovered above golden mountains. And somewhere between them, sweeping across the northern expanse, lay Tartaria, an empire beyond comprehension, its borders melting into the unknown. To the thinkers of Christendom, the East was already strange, a place of silk, spices, and heresy. But Tartaria was something different. It was not foreign, it was other. No missionaries had reached it, no armies had conquered it. It was untouched by the church, unmeasured by any king. To medieval minds, that made it both terrifying and holy. Some believed Tartaria was a remnant of the lost tribes of Israel. Others, the cursed descendants of Gog and Magog, imprisoned by divine wrath behind mountains of ice. For centuries this contradiction endured, an empire too vast to fit inside belief itself. The more Europe explored, the more the mystery deepened. Travelers returned with stories of cities where the sun lingered for months, of rivers that shone like glass, of rulers whose faces were hidden behind veils of silver. No one could prove these things, but no one could disprove them either. And so Tartaria grew, not in land, but in legend. Its borders were drawn not by measurement, but by imagination. Even the maps themselves seemed to breathe. In some, Tartaria stretched across half the world. In others, it fragmented into kingdoms. Great Tartaria, Little Tartaria, Independent Tartaria, each version more uncertain than the last. Yet the name endured. It carried a strange weight, as if the cartographers themselves knew they were writing something sacred or forbidden. Perhaps they did. For in the heart of every mapmaker was the same quiet fear, that what lay beyond their ink might be greater than anything within it. And Tartaria, vast, silent, uncharted, became that fear made visible. It is easy to forget now, when every coastline and mountain peak can be captured by satellite, that once the world was a canvas for awe. Every blank space on those old maps was an invitation to wonder, and Tartaria was the largest blank of them all, the place where mystery itself took shape. In the centuries that followed, explorers would chase that name, seeking the truth hidden behind it. But as they drew the world in sharper lines, Tartaria began to fade, replaced by something more convenient, more ordinary, less alive. Yet in the faded edges of those medieval maps, under clears, candlelight and dust, Tartaria still waits, the last empire of imagination, born in ink and faith. A reminder of a time when the unknown was not a problem to solve, but a story to believe in. And somewhere beyond those borders, one man would claim he had seen it with his own eyes. There are moments in history when the world expands, not through conquest, but through sight. For medieval Europe, that moment began when a young Venetian merchant stepped beyond the horizon and entered a world no Westerner had ever truly seen. His name was Marco Polo, and through his eyes, the great blank of the East would take form, its whispers of legend turning into living breath. He left Venice not as an explorer, but as a witness. The journey began with the hum of markets and the salt of the Mediterranean, then stretched across deserts that shimmered like oceans of glass. The farther he went, the more the world changed. Languages he couldn't decipher, skies that bent differently, stars that seemed to move in unfamiliar constellations. For 3.5 years, the road carried him across Persia, the Pamir Mountains, and into the heart of Asia, toward lands Europeans still considered mythical, painted only in guesswork and prayer. When Polo entered what he would later describe as the realms of Tartaria, it was not a wilderness of barbarians as Europe imagined. It was alive, a civilization humming with movement and precision. Roads stretched farther than sight. Towers rose from plains that had once been thought empty. Cities pulsed with trade, merchants from India, Persia, China, and beyond, mingling in vast markets under banners of silk and gold. These were not the scattered nomads of legend. They were the inheritors of an empire. In the West, the word Tatar evoked terror, an image of wild horsemen and scorched villages. But what Polo found was structure, order, intelligence. The vast machine of the Mongol world, an empire connected not by borders, but by purpose. In its heart stood Karakorum, the ancient capital of the steppe, where the Khan's authority stretched. Across continents, there were laws here, libraries, and even a postal system that spanned thousands of miles. Riders carried messages from the Pacific to the Black Sea in a matter of days, guided by stations stocked with fresh horses and provisions. It was the first great web of human connection, a living network that bound half the world together long before Europe dreamt of such reach. To Polo, it must have felt like standing inside a living map, the unknown suddenly made tangible. In his writings, he tried to capture the vastness of what he saw: cities lit with lanterns, rivers wide as seas, palaces walled in marble, and endless caravans moving under a red horizon. He wrote of people who spoke dozens of tongues, of inventions that seemed centuries ahead of their time, and of a unity that felt impossible for the fragmented kingdoms of Europe. But there was something else too, something deeper, a presence that even he could not explain. The further he traveled, the more he realized that these cities, these towers, these roads, they felt older than the empire that ruled them, as though the Mongols had inherited something ancient, something built by hands whose memory had already turned to dust. Beneath the stories of conquest and trade, there was a hum, the echo of a civilization that predated even the Khans. When Marco Polo returned home after 24 years, his words ignited Europe's imagination. His descriptions of Tartaria shattered centuries of ignorance. He had seen the cities that no one believed existed. He had stood within the empire that blurred myth and reality. Yet even in all his writing, there is an unspoken wonder, a feeling that what he saw was only the surface of something far deeper. Because what Marco Polo brought back was not just knowledge, it was the beginning of doubt. The realization that the East was not an abyss of savagery, but a mirror reflecting a different kind of civilization, one Europe had long refused to see. And though his words gave Tartaria form, they also gave it mystery. For even he, the man who walked its roads, could never truly grasp how old its story was, or how far its roots reached beneath the skin of history. Somewhere beyond his maps, beyond his memory, the real Tartaria still waited, silent, immense, and unseen. Across continents, under different skies and empires, the same shapes rise. Domes crowned with golden light, spires twisting into the heavens, arches carved with impossible precision, all standing as if they share a silent language, a code left behind by hands long vanished. You can walk through Moscow, Istanbul, Samarkand, or even across oceans to San Francisco and find them. The same forms, the same geometry, the same ghost of design. And the question lingers like dust in sunlight. How could buildings born worlds apart follow a single unseen blueprint? It begins with the feeling of déjà vu, the sense that we have seen these structures before, though we can't quite name where. Cathedrals, mosques, government halls, and exhibition domes all echo one another, as if copied from a forgotten plan. Their balance is perfect, their symmetry divine, their proportions almost mathematical in their grace. Some say they are simply the evolution of shared styles, classical influence, architectural migration, artistic imitation. But others see something stranger. They see unity without contact, pattern without source, a fingerprint of something older than memory. Imagine standing before St. Basil's Cathedral, its spiraling domes painted in colours that defy time, or gazing upon the Taj Mahal's perfect reflection in water, every curve, every line, impossibly balanced. Then travel to the palaces of Uzbekistan, the arcades of Venice, the grand civic halls of America's 19th century, all carrying whispers of the same design, different ages, different builders, wide, at one resonance, one rhythm, as if the world had once known a single architectural tongue that we no longer speak. The deeper you look, the stranger it becomes. Some of these buildings seem far older than their recorded history, their foundations built for functions no one can explain. Doors that open into earth instead of air, windows buried beneath streets, columns that appear melted as if they survived some unimaginable heat. And in every corner of the world, rumors persist that these are not the works of our ancestors, but the remnants of something that came before, the ruins of a civilization erased, its structures repurposed by those who found them centuries later. They call it the architecture of Tartaria, a civilization that may have mastered beauty not as ornament, but as science. Their buildings were not only art, but energy, harnessing sound, light, and geometry to create balance in both structure and spirit. We look at them now as relics of style, but what if they were something more? Devices of harmony, monuments of resonance, machines built in stone. Across oceans, across time, these patterns persist. The domes that once caught the thunder of the steppe now capture our imagination. The spires that pierced the northern wind still rise in imitation, even though their makers are gone. It is as if the world cannot stop repeating a memory it no longer understands. Walk through any city long enough, and you begin to see it. The echoes of an invisible plan, a symmetry older than the nations that stand upon it, a beauty that feels inherited, not invented. Perhaps that is the true mystery. Not that these structures exist, but that they continue to guide our sense of what feels right, what feels divine. It is as though the blueprint of Tartaria was not erased, but woven into us, the silent geometry of something we once were. The past, it seems, does not all ways vanish. Sometimes it stands right before us, in stone, in balance, in the quiet perfection of arches that never fall. But if these are the echoes of a forgotten world, what else might it have left behind? If their architecture still stands, what of their technology? The power that might have once filled these walls with light? Beneath the cathedrals and palaces, under streets older than memory, there are traces of something that should not exist. Hidden chambers lined with metal, caverns of brick that seem to serve no earthly purpose, ancient pipes leading nowhere, and towers that reach not for beauty, but for function. Each fragment hums with the same quiet question. What if these were never just monuments of faith, but machines of power? Across the world, from St. Petersburg to Istanbul, from Prague to Delhi, stories persist, whispers of a technology that once shaped the very air. In old diagrams and crumbling foundations, researchers find patterns too deliberate to be decorative. Copper spheres, metallic rods, domes that mirror the resonance of sound. Were they lightning conductors before lightning rods existed? Heating systems before steam? The clues lie buried beneath centuries of plaster and denial. Imagine a world where energy was not extracted, but gathered, where towers drank the sky. Some believe these grand spires and onion domes once captured atmospheric electricity, the invisible pulse of the planet itself, and distributed it through the very bones of their cities. The cross at the top of a cathedral, the finial of a mosque, the orb of a government dome. What if these were not merely symbols but conductors? What if they once lit the world before we learned to burn it? Even in their silence, these structures suggest intention. In Siberia, excavations have revealed underground tunnels lined with brick and iron, labyrinths too precise for simple drainage. In old European estates, chimneys that never smoked led into sealed chambers, as if meant to circulate something other than fire. The architecture of Tartaria, as some call it, feels less like art and more like circuitry, a network that once carried warmth, sound, and light through a civilization that no longer remembers how. It is easy, of course, to dismiss this as myth. History prefers explanations that fit the comfort of progress, that technology began with us, that electricity was harnessed only yesterday, but the evidence doesn't vanish. The same designs appear across continents, in cities supposedly built centuries apart. The same symmetry, the same materials, the same silent logic. It's as if the past was speaking in a language of geometry, and we've simply forgotten how to read it. Perhaps these devices were never meant to be machines as we understand them. Perhaps they were harmonies, attempts to align architecture with the frequencies of the earth itself. The ancients knew that sound could move matter, that vibration could heal, that light could guide. Maybe what we call myth was once science, and what we call science is only the shadow of what was lost. There is a haunting thought buried in this possibility, that progress is not a straight line, but a circle, that civilizations rise, reach for understanding, and then fall into silence, leaving behind ruins we mistake for miracles. As modern cities pulse with artificial light, the echoes of that forgotten brilliance still linger, in the perfect angles of old towers, in the buried tunnels that breathe beneath our feet, in the sense that once, long ago, the world itself might have been the generator. So when we stand before those domes and spires today, maybe we're not just looking at architecture. Maybe we're looking at the remains of a global machine, one that sang with the sky. And if these towers once captured the heavens, then the next question is far deeper, far stranger. What buried them beneath the earth? Beneath our feet, the earth keeps secrets. You can see it in the strangest of places. In old cities where windows sit below ground level, where doors open into soil, and stairways descend not into basements, but into buried streets. At first it seems like an architectural oddity, a simple trick of time. But when you begin to look closer, across continents, across centuries, the pattern repeats. The same half-sunken buildings, the same buried arches, the same whisper beneath the surface. Something happened here. From St. Petersburg to Paris, from San Francisco to Istanbul, entire city blocks seem to have been swallowed by the ground. Archaeologists explain it as gradual accumulation, centuries of dust, debris, and reconstruction slowly raising the streets above the past. But sometimes the evidence feels too sudden, too clean, too deliberate. Perfectly preserved facades with windows half buried. Entrances bricked off where the earth meets the doorframe. It's as if the world, at some forgotten moment, was covered, not by time, but by something far more immediate. They call it the mud flood, a theory, a memory, a mystery. It speaks of a global cataclysm that struck not with fire or ice, but with earth itself. A flood not of water, but of mud. Cities swallowed overnight, civilizations entombed in silence. And in their place, new worlds built atop the old, unaware of what lay just below. Imagine walking through an old quarter of a European city. You pass ornate stonework, columns, arches, all carved with impossible precision. Then you notice something strange. Half the windows sit beneath the pavement, their glass caked with soil. Iron railings disappear into the dirt. A door, once the grand entrance of a building, now opens only a few feet before meeting earth. You step back and it dawns on you, this isn't decay. This is burial. The ground itself has risen to consume the first floors of history. What could have done this? A natural disaster forgotten by record? A shift in the land so slow that no one noticed until it was complete? Or perhaps something else, something that rewrote the surface of the earth in a single, unrecorded moment. In some old cities, excavations reveal entire lower levels. Streets, shops and homes preserved beneath the modern world. Staircases lead down into what were once doorways. Pavement rests on rooftops, and beneath it all, the same strange detail. An architectural style too advanced for its supposed age, as if the buried cities belonged to another civilization entirely, one erased not by conquest, but by soil. In the shadowed silence of these ruins, imagination and evidence intertwine. What if the mud flood was not just a physical event, but a moment of transition? A curtain drawn between two versions of history? What if the world we live in is built quite literally on top of another, one whose memory was intentionally buried under the weight of its own denial? Some researchers believe these buried cities are the remnants of Tartaria, the lost empire whose architecture, symmetry and technology still haunt our world. They suggest that the flood was not natural at all, but engineered, a way to hide the remains of a civilization too advanced, too unexplainable, to fit the narrative of human progress. It's a haunting thought, that beneath every modern street might lie another, perfectly preserved, that beneath our foundations are doors once opened by hands long forgotten. That history itself may be layered like the earth, one truth buried beneath another. Walk any old city slowly enough, and the ground begins to speak. You start to see the unevenness, the lines that don't align, the windows that look out into darkness. You begin to feel that something sleeps there, just below the surface. And as you stand before those buried facades, half stone and half soil, a strange realization takes hold. Maybe the past didn't crumble into dust. Maybe it was simply covered. If so, who buried it? There are moments in history when the world doesn't change. It's rewritten. Not through fire or invasion, but through ink, through quiet rooms filled with scholars, map-makers, and men who decided what the world should look like. In the 19th century, as the modern age unfolded, one name began to disappear from the cartographer's page. Tartaria. Not conquered, not dissolved, simply erased. For centuries, that word had stretched across the top of the world, vast, certain, and untamed. Great Tartaria, printed boldly across the maps of Asia, its reach spanning from the Caspian to the Pacific. Its name was familiar to explorers, traders, and kings. But then, almost imperceptibly, it began to shrink. Each new edition of the world redrew its borders tighter. Each reprint replaced mystery with precision. By the dawn of the 20th century, Tartaria was gone, replaced by Russia, Mongolia, China. Nations we know, nations we can explain. And yet no war marked this change. No collapse, no revolution, no record of surrender. The world simply redrew itself, and with it, an empire vanished. It was the age of modernization, of empire, progress, and science. The old maps, hand-painted and uncertain, gave way to measured lines, to coordinates and grids. The world, once drawn by imagination, was now defined by authority. But in that process of perfection, something was lost. The edges that once invited wonder were smoothed away. The unknown was not explored. It was erased. Perhaps it was convenience. The 19th century was an age that sought order above all things. To govern, you had to measure. To measure, you had to divide. Empires needed clear borders, clear names, and there was no place in that order for a realm as vast and elusive as Tartaria, a land that refused to fit inside the logic of empire. Or perhaps it was something else, a deliberate forgetting, a decision to bury the fact, remnants of a world that didn't align with the new narrative of human progress. History, after all, is written by those who stand on what's left. Imagine the quiet offices where it happened, the gentle scrape of pen on parchment, the steady hands of mapmakers adjusting the lines, no one announcing an end, no proclamations or ceremonies, just ink drying on paper. And with it, the largest unnamed civilization in history fading into silence. Some say it was simply an evolution of cartography, that as knowledge grew, the unknown shrank. But others look at those disappearing borders and see something colder, a decision to redefine truth itself. Because when you remove a name from a map, you erase it from the mind. When a generation grows up without seeing a word, that word ceases to exist. The silence becomes reality. Today, those old maps still survive, fragile, yellowed, tucked in the archives of forgotten libraries. Run your finger over them, and you'll find the ghost of that name, Tartaria. Its letters soft, almost vanishing into parchment, like a memory trying not to be lost. It's unsettling, isn't it? How history doesn't need to burn to disappear. It only needs to be redrawn. The 19th century gave us the modern world. Railways, telegraphs, industry, the illusion of clarity. But it also took something intangible, the freedom to imagine what lay beyond certainty, the right to remember what didn't fit. And so, with a few quiet strokes of ink, the world changed. Tartaria became myth, myth became silence, and silence, as it always does, became truth. But maps can only hide so much. Because for every name erased, there are traces that remain, carved in stone, buried in cities, whispered in stories. The ink may have faded, but the earth never forgets. And somewhere beneath the borders we now call modern, the ghost of Tartaria still lies, waiting for someone to loo. Kay beyond the lines, and see what was never truly gone. There was a moment when maps stopped reflecting the world and began defining it. A moment when the sweep of a quill determined not just where empires ended, but what realities were allowed to exist. In the 19th century, the art of cartography, once filled with wonder, myth, and curiosity, became something else entirely. It became science. It became authority. And under that authority, something remarkable disappeared. For centuries, Tartaria had stretched like a shadow across the roof of the world, an expanse so vast no one could fully measure it. Explorers wrote of it, traders crossed it, and mapmakers printed its name without question. But when science met empire, geography became politics. The age of standardization had begun, and with it came the quietest, most powerful kind of conquest, the conquest of truth itself. The old maps were imprecise, they said, messy, inconsistent, filled with errors. The new world demanded order, latitude, longitude, and certainty. Empires needed clear borders to govern, and scholars needed clean lines to study. Across Europe, commissions were formed to unify geography, to make one world under one system. The British, the French, the Russians, all working to standardize the planet under their vision of precision. It was in that precision that Tartaria vanished. At first it was small. The word began to shrink, its boundaries redrawn under new provinces, Siberia, Central Asia, Manchuria. The cartographers didn't destroy Tartaria. They absorbed it. Bit by bit, it dissolved into the expanding language of empire. By the time global mapping standards were finalized, the word had disappeared altogether. And yet, no one ever announced its end. No decree, no debate. Just absence, clean, clinical, official. A single decision made quietly across many hands. Remove what cannot be defined. In that silence lies the true power of map. We forget that they are not mirrors. They are stories. Every line, every name, every border is an act of narrative. Whoever draws the map tells the story of the world. And in the 19th century, that story was rewritten by nations who claimed discovery as their right and erasure as their method. For the cartographers of empire, precision was not just science. It was control. A mountain only exists where you draw it. A people only exist where you name them. And a civilization only survives as long as someone believes it did. The maps of the modern age left no space for mystery, no room for the undefined. And so, Tartaria, too vast, too uncertain, too ungovernable, was quietly folded out of existence. Today, we call those old maps inaccurate. But perhaps they were only incomplete. Snapshots of a truth the world wasn't ready to understand. Their dragons and blank spaces were not mistakes, but reminders that knowledge has edges. That mystery once had a place beside fact. When we look at modern maps, clean, bordered, perfect, it's easy to forget that the lines we trust are not born from the earth. They are born from decision, and once drawn, they become unquestionable. The erasure of Tartaria was not an act of destruction, but an act of refinement, a surgical removal carried out in the name of progress. The price of precision was wonder. The cost of order was memory. And so, with rulers and ink, the world was standardized, and the unknown was outlawed. But the old maps still whisper. Their paper crackles like static, their colors faded yet defiant. Look closely enough, and you can still see the faint outline of a name once too large to forget. Tartaria. A word erased by perfection. A world lost to the promise of accuracy. And perhaps a reminder that even the most trusted maps may still be lies written beautifully. Somewhere in the basements of history, behind locked doors and fading seals, the silence hums louder than truth. It lives in the airless rooms of forgotten archives, where dust is thicker than memory and light comes in thin, trembling threads. This is where the story of Tartaria still breathes, not in open defiance, but in quiet endurance. No one destroyed the evidence. They simply filed it away. In the imperial archives of London, St. Petersburg, Paris and Istanbul, there are maps that should not exist. Their paper has yellowed, their ink turned sepia with age. Yet on them, Tartaria still stretches like a ghost across the north, its borders bold, its name clear, its presence undeniable. Each one stamped with a word that feels like an epitaph: obsolete. Once these maps were reference, guides for merchants and monarchs alike. Now they lie folded and forgotten, buried in drawers beneath layers of classification. Alongside them rest the journals of explorers whose words no longer fit the modern script, pages describing cities that glowed under northern skies, fortresses built of white stone, and people who spoke languages that no record now recalls. Their handwriting is still there, precise, deliberate, hopeful, their discoveries sealed beneath bureaucratic labels, unverified, restricted, reclassified. You can almost hear the echo of their voices in those vaults, scholars who once believed they were recording the world, only to find that the world they wrote was quietly rewritten without them. The deeper you go into these archives, the stranger it becomes. cabinets filled with maps whose legends no longer match their landscapes, boxes of correspondence between explorers and cartographers, debates about regions that have since been renamed or erased, whole collections of data marked archival error, as if entire civilizations could be deleted with a single stroke of administrative correction. And yet the evidence endures. The pages still whisper. They are too old to lie convincingly, too fragile to falsify. Each map is a time capsule of truth, a moment when Tartaria was real, visible, accepted. And every obsolete stamp feels like a quiet confession. This was known once, but we chose to forget. There is something profoundly human about the way knowledge is buried, not burned, not destroyed, but hidden beneath order. Filing cabinets become graves. Classification becomes denial. The empire doesn't need to silence you when it can drown you in paperwork. Imagine walking those corridors of history. Endless drawers, each labeled with precision, each containing fragments of a world edited out of existence. The air smells of parchment and iron. Every step you take feels like trespass. You find a map, its ink faint but unmistakable. There it is. Tartaria. Not myth, not speculation. Fact, once recorded by steady hands. You turn it over, and on the back, the stamp bleeds through in red. Obsolete. In that single word lies the mechanism of forgetting. The archive becomes the tomb of truth. What isn't destroyed is simply stored where no one will ever look. And so Tartaria wasn't erased by war, nor by time, but by process, by the cold machinery of record-keeping, where memory is managed, and inconvenient histories are quietly folded away. Somewhere, in one of those vaults, beneath a century of dust and deliberate neglect, the story still waits. It sleeps inside pages that no one was meant to open, under seals that no one was meant to break. And perhaps that's the cruelest irony. The truth was never lost. It was merely archived. Because sometimes, the greatest secrets aren't hidden in darkness at all. They're hidden in plain sight, under the careful order of silence. There are many ways to erase a civilization. You can burn its cities. You can bury its ruins. You can silence its name. But the most enduring erasure, the one that lasts beyond centuries, happens not in war, but in the classroom. In the quiet rooms where knowledge is shaped, truth was rewritten. When the 19th century gave way to the modern world, a new kind of empire began to rise, not of soldiers and kings, but of scholars and teachers. Their weapon was certainty, their battlefield, the human mind. Across Europe and beyond, the world was being redrawn, and with each reprint of a textbook, with each newly published atlas, the story of Tartaria faded further from collective memory. It didn't vanish overnight. It was erased softly, methodically, page by page. Where the old maps once showed vast, uncharted lands marked Tartaria, the new editions presented neat borders, modern nations, clean narratives. The mysterious had no place in the age of reason. And so, a name that had once defined half the world became a footnote, and then, nothing at all. Children grew up memorizing maps that no longer showed the North as a frontier of mystery, but as a grid of coordinates and empire. Teachers spoke with confidence, never realizing that the lessons they gave were built atop an absence, a silence passed down like inheritance. Universities reinforced it. Libraries discarded what no longer fit. Research papers replaced curiosity with consensus. And just like that, forgetting became education. It is easy to underestimate the power of repetition. A child shown a map without Tartaria will never question its absence. A generation taught that the past began only with familiar names will never search for those that came before. Memory does not need to be destroyed to disappear. It only needs to be replaced. The brilliance of this quiet rewriting lies in its gentleness. No force, no decree, no flames. Only the soft turning of pages, the calm authority of the printed word. The new truth arrived in the language of progress, of enlightenment, of science. To question it became unthinkable. The very idea of Tartaria was reduced to rumour, myth, or madness, something the rational mind was taught to dismiss. And so, an entire civilization was not defeated. It was redefined. Think about it. The students who once dreamed of the far reaches of the world, of strange empires and uncharted lands, grew up to become teachers themselves. They carried the new maps, the new truths, never realizing what had been omitted. Each generation taught the next how not to see what once was common knowledge. The silence became culture. The blankness became fact. What makes this erasure so haunting is that it worked. The mind, unlike stone, does not preserve ruins. It replaces them. It adapts. It forgets willingly if told enough times that forgetting is learning. And perhaps that is the greatest achievement of those who redrew the world. Not that they changed the maps, but that they changed what we believe maps mean. History is not only written by the victors, it is taught by them. By the time the 20th century dawned, the name Tartaria had become a ghost in the margins, a riddle for the few who dared to look backward. But for everyone else, the erasure was complete. The cover-up was no longer a conspiracy. It was a curriculum. And so the question lingers. Not how Tartaria was lost, but how easily we accepted its absence. Because the greatest mysteries of history are not buried in the ground. They're buried in the mind. Long after the ink had dried, after the maps had been redrawn and the textbooks rewritten, memory did not die. It simply changed its shape. Because while empires record their victories in stone and paper, the people remember in song and silence, in the stories whispered by firelight, passed through generations like fading constellations of truth. Across the frozen expanse of Siberia, in the windswept plains of Kazakhstan, and the high valleys of Central Asia, there are stories that refuse to vanish. Stories older than any history, spoken in languages that no longer exist, about a world that once stood before the silence. They speak of white stone cities that shone under northern suns, towers so tall they caught the stars, and rivers that ran with light. They tell of roads so wide that caravans could travel for days without leaving the sound of footsteps behind, of bridges of silver that connected empires, of domes that glowed at night as though they drank from the sky. But every tale ends the same way, with a great silence, a flood, not of water but of earth. The sky turned dim, the ground rose, and the cities vanished beneath their own soil. Some say it was punishment from the heavens. Others call it the sleep of the old world. The elders, when they speak of it, use only one phrase: the day the ground swallowed memory. No one writes these things down. They are spoken quietly, as if the words themselves might wake something ancient. Around campfires and in shepherds' huts, the oldest still hum the songs, slow, mournful melodies that remember without explaining. In those songs, the name Tartaria is never said outright, yet it lingers in the rhythm. A breath, a heartbeat, a shadow between syllables. In Mongolia they tell of the city of bells, whose towers once sang with the wind before they were buried under mountains of soil. In the Siberian forests, hunters peak of ruins that glow faintly at night, half-buried arches covered in moss and ice. In Central Asia, near the old caravan routes, the desert sometimes exhales strange objects after storms, bricks of unknown origin, fragments of columns, tools forged from metals that modern craftsmen cannot replicate. Archaeologists dismiss them as coincidence, remnants of smaller cultures lost to time. But to those who live close to the land, who listen to its breathing, they are proof, faint, fragile yet undeniable, that the past has not been entirely erased. There is a power in oral memory that no empire can conquer. It bends, it blurs, but it endures. Where history demands evidence, legend preserves essence. It remembers not the facts, but the feeling of what was lost. And that feeling, that faint pulse of something vast, buried and real, still moves through the people of these lands, like a quiet current beneath ice. Even today, when the old ones speak, their voices tremble with something more than nostalgia. It is recognition, a memory that doesn't come from books, but from blood. They may not call it Tartaria, yet when they describe the world before the flood, the world that was unified and radiant, it is the same world the maps once named. And so, while the archives remain locked and the textbooks stay silent, the earth continues to remember, through the mouths of its children. Because empires may erase themselves from paper, but not from the pulse of human memory. In the quiet songs of shepherds, in the breath of old storytellers, in the rhythm of languages that no longer translate cleanly, Tartaria still breathes. And maybe that is how truth survives the longest. Not in history, but in the haunting beauty of what refuses to die. It began quietly, not in universities or museums, but in the glow of computer screens, in late-night forums where curiosity still breathes. The age of the internet, for all its noise and chaos, had done something extraordinary. It connected what the empires had divided. Across continents and languages, ordinary people began to stumble upon the same puzzle pieces, fragments that didn't fit the official picture of history. A photograph of a half-buried building in Russia. An old map showing Great Tartaria stretching across Asia. A postcard from 1890 showing cities with spires and domes more intricate than anything built today. They surfaced like fossils in the flood of information. Small, disjointed, but familiar to anyone who had ever wondered if the past was larger than we've been told. For centuries, the story of Tartaria had been sealed away, forgotten under layers of bureaucracy and disbelief. But the digital age, in its vast indifference, began to unseal it. One image, one archive, one rediscovered book at a time. The world had been redrawn, yes, but the old maps were never destroyed. They were simply waiting for someone to scan them. The rediscovery didn't come from historians. It came from wanderers, from artists, architects and dreamers, people who looked at the past not as a timeline, but as a landscape still alive beneath our feet. They noticed the symmetry between cities oceans apart, the identical facades and domes, the buried windows that hinted at lower floors lost to earth. They began asking questions that academia had long dismissed. Why do cities separated by continents share the same design? Why are the oldest buildings the most advanced? And why, on the maps of old, did one name bind them all? Tartaria. At first the idea sounded impossible, too vast, too grand, too strange. But the deeper people searched, the more the fragments aligned. Forgo, 10 journals resurfaced, explorers' sketches reappeared, and archived blueprints of architecture that shouldn't have existed in the 18th century found their way online. The digital world, designed to erase mystery, was accidentally reviving one. There was a strange poetry to it, a lost civilization returning not through excavation, but through connection. Through the same network that once distracted the world into forgetting, came a spark of remembrance. You could almost feel the pulse of something ancient stirring beneath the surface of the modern world, a quiet awareness spreading like light through cracks in old stone. And with it came a sense of awe, that maybe history wasn't as finished as we thought. Maybe progress had not been a straight line, but a circle, looping endlessly through memory and amnesia. Maybe Tartaria's silence had not been death, but sleep. The rediscovery of Tartaria was not about conspiracy or proof. It was about recognition. The recognition of patterns, of beauty, of questions that refuse to die. It was a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply it's buried, has a way of resurfacing when people start to look together. Across screens and continents, a quiet realization spread. The past still speaks, not in the language of textbooks, but in the patterns of architecture, in the whispers of maps, in the geometry of wonder. And perhaps that is the true miracle of the digital age, that the same technology that fragments our attention has, for once, unified it. United in curiosity, the world has begun to listen again. Tartaria, once erased, now lives in the collective mind of a new generation, not as an empire, but as an idea, a symbol of everything forgotten, waiting patiently for those who still care to remember. The silence is ending, the name has returned, and somewhere between data and dust, Tartaria breathes again. If Tartaria truly existed, if even a fragment of its story is true, then everything we know about history is incomplete. It would mean that progress is not a line, but a loop. That civilization does not climb upward, but turns, endlessly, beautifully, tragically, like a wheel. Perhaps that's why the story of Tartaria feels less like a discovery, and more like déjà vu. Every ruin, every buried city, every forgotten name, they all whisper the same question. Have we been here before? The deeper we look into the past, the more it begins to resemble the future we are building. Towers that touch the clouds, cities powered by invisible forces, societies that believe themselves too advanced to ever fall. The echoes are almost too perfect to ignore. And maybe that is the quiet warning hidden beneath Tartaria's ghost, that forgetting is humanity's oldest habit. Civilizations rise from mystery and collapse into myth. We build, we burn, we begin again. Each time believing we are the first to reach the summit, each time unaware that the mountain has been climbed before. The ruins buried beneath our cities are not relics of primitive ancestors. They are mirrors of ourselves. If Tartaria truly existed, then it was not just an empire. It was a reminder, proof that knowledge can vanish not because it is wrong, but because it is inconvenient. That truth can be buried under the weight of progress, erased by our own need for certainty. We measure advancement by what we can build, but rarely by what we choose to remember. Stand before any ancient structure, the domes that seem too perfect, the stones cut with impossible precision, and you can almost feel it, the hum of something familiar. As if the people who built them were not so different from us, only older, only wiser in ways we no longer understand. Maybe they too once believed their world would last forever. Maybe they too, trusted their maps, their science, their systems, until one day the earth rose, the skies shifted, and the silence began. And when it did, perhaps their memory became myth, their technology became legend, and their truth became taboo. We often think that time is a river, flowing endlessly forward, carrying us away from what was. But maybe it's more like the tide, retreating, returning, erasing its own footprints, leaving behind fragments for those willing to look. If Tartaria existed, then the question isn't where it went. The question is how many times we've done this before. How many empires have risen and fallen? How many worlds have been buried under the comforting illusion that they were the first and the last? And yet, perhaps this is not a tragedy. Perhaps it is a pattern too vast for us to see. Because even in forgetting, something always survives. A symbol, a song, a name on an old map, a whisper in the dust. The memory of what we once were, waiting to be remembered again. The story of Tartaria is not just about a lost civilization. It's about us. About the fragility of truth, the arrogance of certainty, and the quiet resilience of memory. History is not finished. It's still being written, still being erased, still waiting for someone to turn the page back. Maybe one day when our own cities fall silent, someone will find what we left behind. Fragments of light, towers of glass, stories half told. And they will ask the same question we ask now. Who built this? And somewhere through the dust of time, the answer will echo, softly, endlessly. We did. Because the past never truly dies. It only waits for us to remember. And if this story made you wonder, if it made you feel that quiet pull of forgotten history, then stay with us. There are more mysteries waiting, hidden beneath the dust of time, and we'll uncover them one by one. Like the video, share it with those who still believe in questions, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth, where the past is never truly gone, only waiting to be remembered.